President Biden said it's going to be a summer of freedom.
There's an optimism wave among developed countries in which, hey, vaccines are here, vaccines are great, let's just get vaccinated and we can reopen. But we have to realize that most of the world is not vaccinated, and there are new variants, tricky variants, faster, more contagious variants that are emerging.
Hi, everyone, and welcome to another edition of Backstory. I'm Dana Lewis. Covid-19 is not over and done with. We want it to be, right? I've had enough of this too. But I think we have to keep talking about it, and I need to do another podcast on it because there are a lot of mixed messages out there. If you're in India or Brazil or parts of Asia right now, it's the worst of times. Brazil's hospitals are literally collapsing, and there isn't enough medicine to give someone before they get a breathing tube. They've asked veterinarians to share animal medicines. Seriously. And yet here we are in places like the UK and America, where there are a lot of people vaccinated, and it feels like we're coming out of the pandemic. So where are we really? Do you think you're okay because you got a shot or two? Well, I follow two epidemiologists who I really like and respect. One is an American, Feigl-Ding, and here in the UK, Deepti Gurdasani. And I want you to listen to them about what's ahead of us. It is not all summer sunshine. Sorry. All right, Feigl-Ding is an epidemiologist who we often speak to. He's Washington-based. And Eric, you're always days and weeks ahead of official information, I find. So that's why I take a look at your information. Have you got a medical crystal ball there?
Well, it's not as much as a crystal ball as trying to stay ahead of emerging information.
But it's interesting that governments that should be kind of on the leading wave of information tend to be very slow roll on releasing details, even though they say they're being guided by science.
That's right. And in certain ways, they're trying to base policy on solid information. And that's oftentimes how government policies are made. But obviously during pandemic times, you have to stay kind of on the precautionary side. And even though there's not complete, perfect information, you oftentimes have to make policy decisions around that.
So but the pandemic just moves so fast. Based on what you know, are you uncomfortable with, in general, these muscular attempts, sort of frantic attempts by government in Europe and in America to really reopen and get the tourism industry rocking again this summer and put it all behind them? President Biden said it's going to be a summer of freedom yesterday.
Yeah, I think there's an optimism wave among developed countries in which, hey, vaccines are here, vaccines are great. They fight against the virus, against most variants. Let's just get vaccinated and we can reopen. I think in certain ways, I want to go back to normal, but we have to realize that most of the world is not vaccinated, and there are new variants, tricky variants, faster, more contagious variants that are emerging. And these variants oftentimes will cause havoc, such as Victoria, Australia is having a surge. Taiwan is having a surge. Vietnam is having a surge. China is having a surge. Japan is having a surge. A lot of these countries that thought they had defeated are having surges. India obviously still has that catastrophic problem. Brazil is still having catastrophic number of the deaths, and their deaths have stopped falling. Uruguay is surging. Peru, they have enormous amount of excess deaths. All these countries are having still a crisis. And I want to mention that countries like Uruguay is heavily vaccinated. Uruguay has more first shot vaccinations than even the United States. But clearly, it's not stopping the worst variants. And I think governments have to realize, so far, you can be lucky. You can be lucky. There is a luck factor to this virus. The virus has a very large K factor, dispersion factor, in which, the R of, say, 3 or 4 is not always consistently 3 and 4. Sometimes it's 10, sometimes it's 0.5.
Right.
And sometimes you get unlucky. And right now, UK has gotten unlucky. UK obviously is heavily vaccinated, but 2/3 of its shots are AstraZeneca, and AstraZeneca 1 dose we know is not that effective against the Indian variant B1617.2. And now it's 2/3 of all cases that's discovered in the UK now, and in UK's cases are rising again. Hospitalizations are rising again.
Let's just pick through this a little bit geographically, if you don't mind. First of all, you mentioned off the top Australia. I mean, the government has come out, or some of the medical officials have come out there, and you've put that information online as well, saying that this is a very strange variant that just, people eating outdoors or brushing by one another casually. This is not indoor where there's no air circulation or anything. They have transmitted COVID and caught COVID, sort of raising the alarm that we're dealing with something that this was not the old variant, and they're puzzled by how easy it's transmitted. Which variant is it?
That's a very good question. And the announcement by the Premier of Victoria was quite eye-opening yesterday. He was saying that their health chief, based on their contact tracing, there was transmission, not just indoors, in which someone was infected 2 hours after an infectious case left. That person came 2 hours later and was infected, even though the room was empty during that time. And moreover, there were infections in outdoor dining situations, as well as in casual brush by encounters and visiting a shop in which someone walked in, walked out, someone else walked in, walked out. There was no direct contact whatsoever, but these encounters somehow have led to outbreaks. And this is one of the Indian variants, B1617.1. Now, is that the defining feature of B1617.1? We're not sure. So the Indian variants right now are still somewhat nebulous. We know they're more contagious. We're not sure about reinfection. There's some suggestion they're more airborne. By the way, Vietnam says there is a hybrid variant, but the latest WHO says the Vietnam's hybrid variant is the 1617.2 variant. So we're not sure if it's naturally just more potent or there's some natural property around that. But either of these Indian variants, B1617.1 down in Australia, or B1617.2, many other countries, including the UK, they're definitely troublesome.
Because in the UK, they're saying that's 50. They're saying that's 50% more transmissible. The India variant that they have here, more than the UK variant, the Kent variant, which was already 70% more transmissible. I mean, not so rapid and so easily caught that they really do fear now this travel restrictions being lifted, and the government is being criticized by many within the government, saying you're moving too fast. This can really get out of hand on us, and we can have another wave.
Yeah, absolutely. The Indian variants, B1617.2, is at least 30 to 50% faster than the Kent B117 variant. So if you multiply that out, it's likely 2x or more faster than the Wuhan original strain. And that is a serious worrisome. And again, there's a lot of population that's still 1 dose vaccinated. And we know 1 dose is very low efficacy, around 30% or less, some people think. And the AstraZeneca vaccine is, even with 2 doses, it's 60% for symptomatic. So even though we likely think for severe disease, it will be close to 95, 100%, it still is not enough to stop transmission. There's still a lot of susceptible people. And a virus that does not fully, a vaccine that does not fully stop the virus's transmission means it'll keep propagating. And schools need masks for kids down to 5 or 6 years of age, and it needs better ventilation. And U.S. is now recommending HEPA filters and UV disinfection, air cleaners for schools and many other office environments.
I can tell you, my kids in England, Eric, have been told, don't bother with your masks. Essentially, they're not wearing masks in school and haven't been wearing masks in schools here for weeks and weeks.
Yeah, that's very worrisome. If you look at Bolton, near Manchester, its surge is basically among children, school-age children. And whether it's age 5 to 19, that is the peak age. And you know what's the second peak age? Around 30 to 40-year-olds, which is naturally the parents of these children. And we know that there's household transmission. And schools are basically the nexus, the hub and spoke network of this transmission between families. Once it goes from one child to another, then it goes to the parents. And this is why we see huge increase in young people, a dip among 20-year-olds, and then a secondary rise among 30-year-olds, which is exactly the age of most school-age parents.
So where are we headed globally? We have a lot of countries don't have vaccines. You have first world countries now that are progressing rapidly on the 2 doses. The U.S. is doing well. The UK has done well, and they're stepping up those second doses in the sensitive year groups, older year groups over 50 age groups. So are we winning and on the backside of this, or do you foresee in that great crystal ball of yours that we are headed for a disaster of sorts with these variants that continue to try and outrun the vaccines?
In certain ways, I see it where with vaccines, we can hold down the worst surges. Vaccines do reduce transmission enormously. They don't stop it completely. They do, and hospitalizations hopefully are mitigated because of the vaccines. But we still have a very large pool of susceptible people. And actually, if you adjust for vaccination rates, among unvaccinated people, the incidence rate has not gone down. In fact, in many places, even in these vaccinated countries, the incidence has been flat, if not has gone up among unvaccinated people. And that's the concern, where although the vaccinated are protected, a lot of countries have large pools of people, like 30% who are vaccine hesitant to vaccine resistant. And I worry for that, and we're still going to see surges. And if we let the virus proliferate through the rest of the world, where there's still huge, huge lack and dearth of vaccines, more variants will rise. And one day we'll get unlucky to find a worst of both worlds that is highly transmissible, highly reinfectious, vaccine breakthrough prone. And we might have another crisis again. And so
we could lose all of the ground. We could lose all of the ground that's been gained.
Yes, we would lose all the ground we gain. It would basically be almost, if we see such a variant, it would almost be a new strain, because it would potentially be such reinfection prone and highly contagious that it's almost nothing like the original Wuhan that is very, very amenable to vaccines and not that contagious compared to all the variants that we have today. I'm worried that it could come back and bite us, because in certain ways, when we're vigilant, people have adapted to that. But once we go back to normal and we delude ourselves that everything's normal too quickly, we let down our guards, it'll come back to bite us. And what's worse than a little bit longer mitigation is a yo-yoing. This yo-yoing roller coaster of up and down, reopen, closure, that's not what we want. That's not going to lend itself to economic stability for economic development. What we need now is just a little bit more patience, a little bit deferred gratification, that if we get the cases low, and keep the mitigations in place like masks in schools and ventilation in schools and these air cleaners in schools, which are not that expensive, let's be honest, on the grand scheme of what children cost in public education. If we just did these extra steps, we could literally stamp it out. And if we ramp up our vaccine production, there's a plan out there to deliver 8 billion doses of the vaccine, to scale them up for only $4.50 a dose, if we commit to that. But right now, we're not committing to it. So I think there's two prongs. One, we have to keep mitigations up in addition to vaccines. And two, we need to roll out vaccines to the rest of the world on a scale we haven't seen before.
Give me, as we wrap up here, just a couple of yes or no's on some questions. Will you, knowing what you do, will you sit in a restaurant inside or outside with no mask?
Outside, I would still be generally okay. Inside, depending on if it's ventilated or not, and if I'm comfortable with the people there, that they're likely vaccinated, in a high vaccine area, I would be okay for brief periods, if not over capacity, and if I'm confident that the demographic, say not a bar or nightclub, but a demographic in which I'm comfortable that most people are vaccinated. Yes.
How do you travel on an airplane? Do you wear a mask?
Of course, always wear a mask on an airplane.
Will you go to a gym? If you were going to a gym, would you go to a gym and work out with no mask?
I think that's tricky because gyms are very hot, heavy huffing and puffing, and gyms vary by ventilation. I try to see how well ventilated it is. Generally, I would avoid it for now, but if it's heavily ventilated and it's not a very crowded room with 20 different people in one room doing a spin class, if there's a sufficient distance and not high density, then I would do it for brief periods.
And then the last question, and I think I already know your answer, is that if you're sending your kids to school, despite direction from the school, as a parent, you would want them to what? Wear a mask all day?
Yeah, I would definitely still recommend kids wear a mask. And of course, at lunchtime, that's the tricky part where kids need to eat lunch, but they don't have a good solution in many cafeterias. I don't have a good answer for that, but I also encourage parents to tell their schools, teachers, principals, superintendents to impose and add these air ventilation upgrades, these air quality, air cleaning upgrades for classroom, like 1 HEPA filter per classroom would be wonderful. I think those would make a huge, huge difference in the risk of transmission in schools.
I mean, I guess the problem with schools is that they take government advice. And the government advice here in the UK, for instance, has been they've dropped the mask mandates. And the schools say, well, we just follow government advice, which is unfortunate. And it's kind of a cop-out, I think, as a parent. But that's what they do.
Yeah, it is a cop-out. But at least you can tell your child to still wear a mask. Wearing a mask is still not against school rules, I hope. And I would try to talk to teachers to donate a HEPA filter to your schools if possible. Because I think...
what a great idea.
I think that would be something in which you could take into your own hands. And it's just an air cleaner. It's not a medical device or anything. That I think if we can convince our schools to do it ourselves, for those who want to take advantage and can afford to, I think it would be really great for our classrooms. And hopefully teachers and principals would not be against that. All
right. Eric Feigl-Ding, thank you so much. It's always I know you're a busy guy. So when I'm able to get you, I really do value that time and the people who listen to this. So thank you so much.
Great. Thank you. Stay safe.
Deepti Gurdasani is a UK-based epidemiologist. I think you're in Cambridge right now, Deepti.
That's right.
Tell me, is the government lying or suppressing information on the statistics and data on children and COVID in schools?
It does appear so. So there are reports from The Observer, which is a newspaper here, which suggests that on the 13th of May, data on schools and the new variant, the so-called Indian variant or the Delta variant, were due to be released, but that data was withheld at the behest of our government on number 10, which is really, really concerning. These data essentially have been requested for several weeks now from unions, from scientists, even from MPs who put in questions and not received any response. And the reason that we've been so keen to understand this and get this data is that on the 17th of May, the government, without providing a lot of explanation, removed recommendations for masks in schools. We have very few mitigations in schools here in the UK. Often children go into schools with large classes of up to 30 children. We have bubbles that go up to hundreds of people in size. We have little access to ventilation apart from open windows and doors, and not all classrooms have those. And we don't have masks now in primary or secondary schools. And that's really concerning because all of this is out with CDC recommendations. And we as scientists have been trying to understand on what basis the government has made these decisions and asking for the data, particularly with the spread of the new so-called Indian variant, which we know is happening among children. We are very concerned about this, but the data are not being released, despite now a pre-action letter being put in by a group which is due for response by tomorrow. I don't believe that they've received a response yet.
So this data normally by the British government is released and then suddenly wasn't released. What do you think it's going to tell us?
Well, I mean, it's not, I guess, normally released because we normally don't have necessarily new variants in the UK. So it was specifically asked, we know this data exists because the Observer did a piece and they've seen the page that wasn't released. And we know that obviously the data existed but wasn't released. I think we're all very worried that what we're going to find is that there is a lot of spread of this new variant in schools. And we're already seeing signs of that. For example, we know that in places where this variant is dominant, the cases in school-age children, particularly secondary schools, have been 3 times as high as other unvaccinated young adults, like 20 to 24-year-olds. And this is a consistent pattern across places where this variant is dominant. And we've then seen spread from these age groups into other age groups in the community, suggesting that schools are actually not just contributing to transmission, but really driving the spread of this new variant across the population.
And in fact, some people have said that some of the higher levels of COVID now in 30 to 40-year-olds, which traditionally, statistically would be the parenting group, that they are much higher.
Absolutely. And we see that sort of double dip pattern where you see high infection rates in children and then what we consider the parental age group prior to spread into the other age groups, which is quite consistent with whatever we've seen whenever schools have been opening. Infection rates have skyrocketed up among children. And of course, we hear news reports of numerous schools with large outbreaks, schools having to close, bubbles having to close. But we don't have any systematic data on this, which we urgently need to understand what policies should be in place to prevent this highly transmissible variant spreading.
It's just the last thing you would expect the government to do is to hide data. I mean, they're supposed to be working with scientists all over, just not on their advisory committees, but scientists all over the world and all over the country to understand where they're headed with these variants and why suppress data. It's like, because why? The government policy to open for the summer and to allow travel, they're alarmed that this data will spin some of that backwards? Or
So it's very hard to say. I mean, the independence of a public health agency, and Public Health England in the UK is like, in England is like, let's say, CDC in the US. You know, the independence of a public health agency like that in the middle of a pandemic is paramount. And the transparency with the public is absolutely essential for public trust and to hold government policy to account. I think the narrative from our government, at least, has been that they've always followed the evidence, followed the data, and not dates. Rather, not follow this sort of a series of easing steps in lockdown that they actually laid down in February. Unfortunately, that doesn't really appear to be the case because the data has strongly argued or cautioned against, as have the government's own scientific advisors, against the sort of opening up plan that the government is following, as well as the dropping of mitigations in schools. So I think part of this is sort of meant to, I guess, justify policy that's not based in evidence. And I think government is possibly worried that they might be challenged if this data does come out. And it might really question the steps they've taken because they were clearly aware of this data weeks ago.
Are you being alarmist? Because President Biden has said it should be a summer of freedom. The UK government is, slowly putting countries on their green travel zones where you don't require quarantine when you come back from those countries. They're saying that generally rates are falling. People are getting vaccinated. Why shouldn't we be opening up and relaxing?
Sure. So let's look at it objectively. We have a new variant in this country that we know from our own data is showing that it might be 60 to 70% more transmissible than our previous variant, which was already 60% more transmissible than the previous variant. That's highly transmissible. We know that this variant has caused devastation in India and is continuing to cause devastation in places like Bangladesh, Pakistan, Nepal. We also know that it's a variant that's become dominant in the UK. It's gone from almost not being present at the end of March to being our dominant variant in a matter of weeks. It's been doubling week on week amid restrictions. So prior to all the easing steps, it was doubling week on week while our other variant was dropping. That's a highly fit variant. We also know that it has a high level of escape against vaccines. So, for example, a single dose of vaccine, which is what much of our population had because we adopted this policy of increased gaps in vaccines, provides only about 30% protection against symptomatic disease. And you need 2 doses to have a much higher level of protection. And this variant obviously is a major risk to public health response, even with the current level of vaccination, because only about 39% of our population is fully vaccinated. That leaves 60% of our population either with 1 dose or completely unvaccinated. And our own scientific advisors have essentially said that with the current level of vaccination, with a highly transmissible variant that has a level of escape against vaccines, we are due to reach a level of hospitalizations at or above our second wave, which was devastating. So it's not alarmist at all because our own scientific advisors have done modeling that shows that such a variant could cause devastation despite the fact that 40% of our population is fully vaccinated. So we do have to listen to that.
Do you think that we are in the initial steps of that wave?
There's no doubt about that. We're seeing exponential rises in England and Scotland. Scotland is a bit ahead of England. And worryingly, those rises are also being accompanied by a rise in hospitalizations. So, that link between cases and hospitalizations that we hope, is weakened by vaccination. It almost certainly will be weakened by vaccination. It's not been broken. And we're still seeing rise in hospitalizations as cases rise. And that is a sign of what is to come. And, we have our hospitals.
This is so confusing. I don't mean to interrupt, but it's really confusing, right? And that's one of the reasons I wanted to talk to you. And I know you and other epidemiologists who are conservative in your approach to opening up and feel that the government shouldn't be putting the economy before health concerns, that you have to balance the two. But I mean, saying you're going to balance something is a convenient way sometimes of compromising on the health side. But
well, first of all, I don't believe the balance thing at all, because I think our economy is inextricably linked with public health. And if you don't control the pandemic, your economy will suffer, because I feel like if you're not cautious now, we're heading towards another lockdown, which would have a huge impact on the economy and on public health. So I think the best way to protect public health, economy, is also to protect public health. So I don't see those two things as different at all.
But most people now have been listening to the government. They've gotten their first vaccine. They're probably going to get their second vaccine in a few weeks. In the UK and the US, a lot of them have it. Unfortunately, many countries aren't even in that position. But they think, okay, we can start going to restaurants again. We can start going to the gym again. We can start jumping on airplanes and and going out for the sun, spending a couple of weeks outside the country. And you're telling me that you think you wouldn't do any of that.
No, I mean, this is a highly transmissible variant. We just need to listen to stories from across the country. I mean, see what's happening in Vietnam. They've had 0 cases for a long period of time, and their pandemic has lost control because these cases have spread into the community before their test trace system could keep up with it, because it spread so rapidly. We're hearing reports from Australia that, people are getting infected 2 hours after entering a room that somebody else was in. That's an aerosol transmitted, highly infectious variant. And this is the sort of variant that can rapidly get out of control. I mean, we saw this happen in India. We've seen this happen in different countries. We have global evidence. So allowing such a variant to become dominant across the globe, which is where we are headed now, because that's what happened with the so-called Kent variant, would be hugely irresponsible. I mean, this is not a variant we should learn to live with. It's a variant that we need to stamp out because, as you say, many countries don't have massive levels of vaccination. And even countries who do, first dose doesn't protect you to the extent that you need with these variants. So we need to, for me, this really highlights we need to pivot to elimination strategies. And it's not just about this variant. I mean, each variant that we see, is fitter than the previous one, outcompetes the previous one, and brings us closer to vaccine escape. I mean, I'm very, very glad that this doesn't fully escape vaccines and that 2 doses are still highly effective. But what if another variant comes in that doesn't have that? What happens to pandemic response?
Is that inevitable, do you think, if we keep doing this yo-yo, seesaw, open, close, half close, half open? Do you think it's inevitable that we reach this point, even with all the vaccinations, that's it? We have a variant suddenly that's identified that the vaccines are not going to work against? And do they just go back to the lab and come up with a new vaccine like that? Or is it much more complicated?
So I don't know about inevitable, but it's highly likely. And I don't think it's just a hypothetical, because we know there are variants that exist now that with very high levels of escape against vaccines. The so-called beta variant, or the so-called South Africa variant is one of those. And there's very good data from University of Cambridge that shows the best conditions for the virus to adapt towards escape is when you allow high transmission with vaccination of the vulnerable predominantly, because then what you have is high levels of transmission among populations that mix, that are not as vaccinated. The virus spreads and comes into contact with this wall of immunity or selection pressure, and variants that are more likely to escape become selected. So that combination of transmission and selection pressure creates a fertile ground for that sort of escape. And we're just going to start seeing that now as more and more countries have a high level of vaccination. We haven't had that level of selection pressure in the population yet. So we really haven't seen the entire breadth of the mutational landscape of this virus. And it's very, very likely that we're going to get more escape mutants that are more likely to escape. And the problem is our entire strategy has been based on vaccination. So much resource has been put into vaccination. And yes, people say we can update vaccines, but how are you going to keep up with virus evolution? I mean, we've heard recently that AstraZeneca is in the process of developing a vaccine that works against the so-called South Africa variant that our government in the UK is now ordering. But that's not a dominant variant anymore. In fact, it's been outcompeted completely by the Delta variant. Now we need vaccines that work against the Delta variant. And by the time they come into place and we vaccinate a substantial number of people with them, there will be another variant. And this virus is not mutating to become flu, like some people say. It's mutating at every step to become more transmissible, possibly more fatal. We don't know that about the Delta variant yet, but certainly the Kent variant did, and towards more escape. And unless we exercise our agency to prevent that, we can't expect the virus to stop adapting. And the only way to prevent that is to stop transmission.
Deepti Gurdasani, it's always great to talk to you. Thank you so much.
Thanks for having me.
And that's our backstory on COVID-19. Look, it's your health, and it's your family's health. Be cautious. This is a weird virus, probably an escaped virus that was manipulated in a lab in Wuhan for gain of function experiments. You don't need it. And a vaccine doesn't protect you 100%. Keep some social distancing this summer. Eat outside. Don't bother with trying to get back to normal so fast. Stay healthy. I'm Dana Lewis. Please share Backstory, and thanks for listening. And I'll talk to you again soon.